always been quite technologically advanced and sophisticated.
갑자기 지식인 학자로서 양심상 도저히 거짓말은 할 수 없었는지 이렇게 말하는데요.
I am now persona non grata in China, but nonetheless, I think it's true. It is an absolutely perfect glaze, and you cannot imagine more perfect, more beautiful carving.
Good evening.
이곳은 미국의 포틀랜드 미술관입니다. 서양 사람들에게 훌륭한 아시아의 문화를 강의해주는 시간을 종종 가지곤 하는데요. 이날 강의를 맡게 된 전문가는 로버트디모우리입니다. 그는 저명한 미술사학자이자 2000년까지 하버드대학교 동아시아 미술 교수로 재직했으며 중국의 지원을 받고 하버드 미술관 큐레이터로 일하며 중국 미술을 깊게 공부하다 한국 미술에 푹 빠져버린 분입니다.
Thank you, Mary Beth, for that very gracious introduction, and good evening to all of you. It is a great pleasure to be with you, just as it's always a pleasure to be in Portland, even when it's hot.
한국의 청자를 알기 위해 먼저 한국의 역사를 알아야 한다고 하는데요.
What we will look at anticipating the development of the Celadons is basically going to come from down here in the southeast, the Shilla kingdom, a few things from the Kaya kingdom as well. Korea was a very, very wealthy kingdom, particularly the southeast, Shilla. Our perception in the West, and particularly in the U.S., has been badly distorted by programs like MASH and things like that, and memories of the Korean War and such. And the 19th century, the first part of the 20th century, were difficult periods for Korea, most admittedly. There was an economic decline in the 19th century. There was Japanese colonization from 1910 until 1945. During the first part of the 20th century, there was World War II, there was the Korean War. Of course there were hardships, but that is an historical anomaly. During much of Korea's history, as you will see based on the works of art tonight, during most of Korea's history, it was a very wealthy nation that produced surpassing works of art, which they were able to do not only because of knowledge, sophisticated techniques, but also because of the wealth. And the wealth in the Three Kingdoms period, in, say, the 5th, 6th century, is symbolized by gold crowns like this, which were used by the rulers, and other gold materials as well. Some kind of ritual belt, probably not for religious purposes, but probably a mark of royalty, a mark of status, and such. And for use in certain palaces and such, there were even gold vessels. And we will see that some of these gold vessels, dating to the 5th and 6th centuries, would influence the shape and the appearance of ceramics of the period. But I show these as evidence of the wealth during that period.
얼마 전까지만 해도 서양인들은 한국을 거의 빈민국 수준으로 생각하고 무시해왔었는데요. 요즘 들어 한국 대기업이나 한류 문화로 인해 서양인들이 조금씩 알아가고 있지만 아직도 잘 모르는 서양인들이 생각보다 많습니다. 이에 먼저 한국에 대한 선입견을 깨야 했고 전쟁 이후 잠시 어려웠던 나라였지만 아주 오래 전부터 한국은 상당히 부유했던 나라라며 당시 유물들을 먼저 소개합니다.
Styles that express their own aesthetic vision. But it's just to say that by the 7th century, much of Korea was Buddhist. It wasn't really a state religion yet, but it was widely practiced, and the Buddhist arts were extremely sophisticated. Now, when we begin looking at ceramics, this is typical of the type of ceramic ware that was produced during the Three Kingdoms period in the 5th and 6th centuries. It is not glazed. Glazing doesn't really become widespread in Korea until the Koryo dynasty with the Celadons. But the reason it's important to introduce this early ware is that it's not just a matter of adding glaze to a ceramic piece. To have a beautiful Celadon glaze, like we're going to see, it has to be a very high temperature fired ceramic ware. We can more or less judge a particular society or civilization's level of technological achievement by looking at the metalwork that they produce and also by looking at the ceramics. The reason for that, it's not a matter of looking at the beauty of the pieces, it's a matter of looking at the technology that went into it. It is difficult to produce kilns that can reach the high temperatures necessary to fire this kind of ceramic ware. Putting it in context, this is stoneware, as we'll see in a minute. But what that means, it has to be fired in a kiln that can reach and sustain temperatures in the range of 1100 to 1200 degrees centigrade. The Chinese were the first people in the entire world to be able to do that. The Chinese have always been quite technologically advanced and sophisticated. Chinese were able to reach and sustain those temperatures as early as, say, 1100 to 1200 BC. There was not a continuous history of firing ceramics at that temperature, but they were first able to do it then.
한국 도자기에 대해 설명하던 중 갑자기 중국의 발전된 기술력과 도자기를 최초로 개발했다고 강의하는데요. 중국의 지원을 받기 때문인지 중국을 중간에 한 번씩 끼워 넣고 있습니다.
The next people in the world to do it were the Japanese, learning from the Koreans and indirectly from the Chinese, probably in, Mary Beth will correct me, but 5th century. Some of those early pots look like these. When we get to the next peoples are in the Southeast Asia, 10th, 11th, 12th century, and we poor people in the West, in Europe and in the Americas, don't reach those temperatures until, say, 16th, 17th centuries. So we're something of laggards when it comes to these kinds of things. But it indicates the high degree of technological prowess, and had they not developed the skill to do that, the techniques to produce kilns of that type, they would not have been able to produce Celadon wares. Now, like I said, Celadons had a long history of, say, 800 years of development in China, where the Chinese perfected the Celadon glaze and such. The types of Celadons that the Koreans were seeing that were made in China and that were being imported into Korea in the 9th and 10th centuries, when the Koreans began to experiment with putting glazes on those stoneware pieces that they were all ready to make, this is the kind of Chinese Celadon ware that they were seeing. They were produced around Hangzhou, they're south of Shanghai that I showed you on the map. This became the model that the Koreans were looking at. So where were the Koreans making it? Well, like I said before, this southwestern region of Korea.
그렇게 청자가 한국에서 처음 만들어지게 된 계기가 됩니다. 중국에서는 몇백 년 동안 개발하고 발전해 왔지만 기술이 한국에 들어오자 단숨에 중국의 기술력을 뛰어넘어 오히려 중국으로 다시 역수출하기에 이릅니다. 과연 한국은 어떤 것을 만들었을까요?
Here in the gallery, the earliest of the, again, we're not going through the experimental phase. This is the earliest mature phase of Celadon development in Korea. They're not decorated with flowers and birds and other scenes like that. They're usually plain, relying on the tautness of form and the beauty of glaze for their aesthetic appeal. But this is a very good example with a very wonderful bluish-green color. Another example, this is a Buddhist ritual vessel, which we call a kundika, using the Sanskrit name for a jingping, jungpyeong in Korean, but usually using the Sanskrit name of kundika. It's one where it is used in all the lands where Buddhism traveled. Shape changes a little bit from culture to culture. There would have been a little cover there. You can see the little hole for a hinged cover. The holy water put in there, and again dispensed through the spout. But this is a very beautiful Celadon piece in the Fitzwilliam Museum at Oxford University. This one now begins to have, instead of just undecorated, you begin to find finely incised decoration around there and some floral decoration down here. And in terms of the shape, you see that, of course, most of the kundika vessels were made in bronze, whether in China, in India, or wherever. And you see that the shape, that's probably just a little bit later, but roughly contemporaneous. In Korea, it was typical to elongate the shape, very beautiful. That one is bronze that's inlaid with silver wire. We'll see that again in a little bit, and then a silver ornament up there. But you can see how closely the ceramic example follows its bronze prototype. Going back to this one, now there's beginning to be emphasis on decoration rather than just a plain undecorated vessel or one with very subtle incised decoration like the kundika that we saw. This is carved decoration. The difference being, incised decoration is like using a pencil. You're using a sharp stylus and making fine lines. Carved decoration is like a very, very, very low relief. It is using a scalpel, probably bamboo, possibly metal, but just carving away a little bit. Here, making a beveled line so that the actual lines themselves seem to jump up because of intaglio elements on either side. But it is a floral scroll, like I said, improbably with a phoenix flying through it. But here you have beautiful incised carved decoration under an absolutely perfect glaze. Or this is one of the greatest, as far as I'm concerned. I'll take it home any day. Unfortunately, it's not in my museum, it's not in your museum, but it's in the Art Institute of Chicago. It's a little oil bottle, no more than about 3 or 4 inches high, but it has the most exquisite carving that you can imagine. And here is one of those places where I would emphasize that Korean celadons, at their very best, are every bit the technical and aesthetic equal of the very best contemporaneous Chinese ceramics. One really cannot say that about the Chinese-style ceramics produced by any other culture. Here, this is every bit the aesthetic and technical equal of Chinese ceramics of the day. I am now persona non grata in China, but nonetheless, I think it's true. It is an absolutely perfect glaze, and you cannot imagine more perfect, more beautiful carving than on this little bottle.
이 말을 끝냄과 동시에 다음 화면으로 다급하게 넘기게 되고 다른 이야기로 전환하려 하는데요. 그는 중국의 지원을 받고 중국 문화를 소개하는 전문가로 소속된 상태였기 때문에 사이사이 중국을 최고라 할 수밖에 없었습니다. 그렇기에 모우리는 한국 역사와 도자기를 강의하며 중국 도자기를 계속 끼워 넣었던 것이죠. 하지만 양심에 찔렸던 그는 결국 진실을 말하고 마는데요.
This is going to change the entire picture. When we move quickly into the last of the historical dynasties and look at the Joseon period, the Korea dynasty falls in 935, Korea over there. Not 935, that's when it completely vanquished Shilla. The Joseon dynasty takes over in 1392, and the territory expands so that the territory of the Joseon dynasty is roughly that of all of Korea today, North and South Korea combined. So the line that you see up there at the top is basically the line between North Korea and China today. The capital of Korea had been there at modern Kaesang, which is not really marked over here, but anyway, right up here a little ways. The capital of Chosun became Seoul. So Seoul has been the capital of Korea since the late 14th century. Now, before we look at the porcelain, which I'll do in just a second, what happened to celadon ware? Well, celadon ware goes into a decline. There were serious economic issues in the 14th century, and this becomes the tail end of the celadon tradition. It is not as vibrant as it was before. The glaze is thinner. It has less color, so the pieces tend to look somewhat gray. In addition, a lot of representation. The border elements can become very large and almost domineering. But what it gives rise to is puncheong ware. Puncheong is a modern name. It's no longer the sophisticated ware. It's no longer the palace ware, the highly expensive ware that this tradition had been in Korea. But it is the successor to celadon ware. It's light gray stoneware. The decoration uses slip, and it has a very pale celadon glaze over the surface.
고려 청자와 분청사기를 간략하게 강의 후 새로운 것에 대한 강의를 이어갑니다.
To keep in mind are that it's a period of state, Buddhism is a state religion, extraordinarily richness in the painting and the beautiful celadons. When we move into the Joseon dynasty, from 1392 up until 1910, Buddhism is pushed aside. That is, it's not eliminated, but it's no longer the state religion, it's no longer the state philosophy. Neo-Confucianism comes in from China. It is a very restrained, austere kind of Confucianism in Korea. And instead of having the rich robes, the kind of robe to think of to emblemize the Joseon period is the scholar's white robe. This would be one type of attire for a scholar. That sort of typifies Joseon Korea. And so then keep in mind that instead of the rich celadon wares and such, the preferred ceramic ware is porcelain. Part of the reason for this is imitating China. They have pushed Buddhism aside. They're looking to China anew. They're looking at the then newly established Ming Dynasty, which was established in 1368. Joseon is established in 1392, just a few decades later. And they're thinking, well, gee, the king of Joseon is saying, look, if the emperor of China can have porcelain on his table, I want porcelain on my table. I don't want those old celadons anymore. And so you have the rapid rise of the porcelain tradition, and this is part of the reason for the death knell of the celadon tradition, that it descends sort of into a humble middle-class ware of the bunchang that we were just looking at. So that's a 17th to 18th century bottle, but these typify this taste for austerity in the Chosun. So we already said that the Koreans had learned to make porcelain in the Koryo dynasty, so that when the king of Chosun wanted porcelain vessels, the potters were able to rise to the challenge. Now, by the 15th century, it would be hard to tell on the basis of the photograph which is which. This is a 15th century Chinese undecorated porcelain piece. That's a color photograph. This is a black and white photograph, but still a 15th century Korean porcelain piece. They're able, in the same way that they learned to make the celadons by imitating and mastering Chinese techniques and then going on to develop their own aesthetic vision, they do the same thing with porcelain. They copy, they imitate, they get it exactly right, and then they move on to express themselves the way they want to. So this is an early Korean blue and white piece. Not many of these survive. They probably weren't made in great quantity, but also with all the wars in Korea, historically, not just the Korean War, but the Hideyoshi invasions of the 16th century, other things like that. Many early Korean ceramics from the Chosun period that were still in use at the time of these wars and such have disappeared. But this is a very important example of a 15th century blue and white piece. Of course, the inspiration of Chinese blue and white ware. At this point in the 15th century, the Chinese blue and white ware is more sophisticated in terms of its aesthetics and its technique. But be forgiving. The Chinese already had 100 years to develop blue and white ware. The Koreans are just beginning. And I would say that for just someone who is just beginning, it's not a bad relationship. It's a very pretty blue, a very pure cobalt. If you don't know how to purify the cobalt, it's going to be sort of purplish or sort of grayish and not very attractive. At the same time, that's a very pretty royal blue. They've obviously imitated the floral scroll and such.
한국과 중국의 옛 지도를 보여주며 아시아 문화가 이렇게 발전할 수 있던 계기는 처음 만들어진 기술을 서로 교류하게 되고 섞이면서 좋은 시너지를 냈기 때문이라고 말합니다. 한국은 계속해서 개발하고 발전해 나가기 시작합니다.
By the 16th century, they're producing extraordinarily beautiful white vessels. And keep in mind, the taste in Korea was basically for pure white, undecorated vessels, but of course they made others as well. In China, we think of blue and white ware and things like that. For some reason in the 15th and 16th centuries, there is very little blue and white ware. Part of it is it just doesn't survive. Another part, cobalt was expensive, and they probably wanted to use iron, which is not as expensive. So this is unique to Korea. Some of them are pictorial, as we'll see in just a minute. Some of them are quite whimsical, like this. It's hard to tell what it is. Is it a bottle on a leash with a collar around the neck? Who knows? It's kind of a whimsical design, but extraordinarily well done. But then we move into things like this, which are truly beautiful. As beautiful in underglazed iron brown as a blue and white piece would be. Now, we are told by records that court painters were sent from the royal palaces in Seoul to the kilns to train the potters, that is, the ceramic decorators, how to paint in a court style and such. And one thing that we see, knowing that connection, is we see a much closer correspondence between painting on paper and silk in Korea and decoration on ceramic ware. So you look at that, then you look at a painting, contemporaneous, on silk, and put them side by side, and you see that the relationship is pretty close. But there are relationships that are even closer. This is moving on to the 17th century. And when we see Korean pieces, by the 17th century, we're seeing pieces that have a distinct, apart from the iron brown, a distinct aesthetic vision different from that in China. In China, you think of the entire vessel being decorated. You think of very heavy, emphatic borders, top and bottom. Here, the upper portion of the vessel is decorated, but in addition, it is an asymmetrical but balanced design. And so this is, combined with the underglazed iron brown, is a new aesthetic, unique to Korea. Where did that type of design come from? Again, look at the painting tradition. This is a pair of album leaves by the same artist, closely related. Put it side by side, and once again, the decoration that you see on that jar over there in underglaze iron brown is right out of the painting tradition. Not necessarily this painting, but something very close to it. Or you look at something like this, and for a long time people, what is this weird design? In San Diego. And I was there a year ago and was able to solve it for them. It is a orchid and rock kind of decoration, a little bit harder to recognize in the ceramic piece. But even in the 19th century, I'm just showing you across the board down to the 19th century, from 17th, 18th, 19th, that close relationship between painting and ceramic decoration persists in a very, very interesting way.
도자기에 그려진 그림을 흥미로워하며 또 다른 도자기를 설명합니다.
Now, in the late 17th and 18th century, we begin to see more blue and white ware. Again, many cases, there will be no borders. It will be a very quiet, a very austere, a very subtle presentation. In this case, just a sprig of bamboo. And there is a taste for faceted bottles. Of course, sometimes they have circular ones or a circular footprint, but that's an octagonal bottle. No particular symbolism to it. They just like the appearance of that. Sometimes these are always called wine bottles, and many of them probably were. But when we look at paintings, and this is not so much a full painting per se, but it's a detail from an altar spirit painting. When we look at it, we see the altar table here, and plaques to the ancestor there. But here's a bottle, here's a bottle. They're serving as vases. In this case, here's a detail, the bottle that we saw, and a bottle very similar to it, whether it's faceted, whether it's circular, but it has either a single little floral spray or a bamboo sprig, something like that, a lotus and feathers and things like that. So just to give a hint of how these things function.
이번엔 고려 청자에 이어 한국을 대표하는 이것에 대해 설명합니다.
The difference between Chosun on the right with Neo-Confucianism, emphasis on austerity, and white really being the primary color. On the left, we see Korea, richness, bright colors, a taste for celadons, and then for the ceramics, the white ceramics of Chosun, the beautiful celadons of Korea. I think the Express got bogged down, but that was the Express through Korean ceramics. If there are time for questions, and if Mary Beth will permit, we could take a question or two. If time doesn't permit, then you have to invite me back. What else can I say?
강의가 끝나자 박수가 쏟아지는데요.
많은 사람들이 서로 먼저 질문하려 합니다. 누군가가 손을 번쩍 드는데요.
Yes. It's very difficult to limit myself to one, but anyway, okay, three. You hit the right number. One, the little cup stand that was molded, that had the molded cup stand and the cup on top. Number two, which probably is my favorite, that bowl with the celadon glazed bowl with a little boy playing amongst the lotus flowers. And number three, that last bottle that I showed you, the faceted bottle. If you aren't careful, I'll walk out with them. Anyway, I love those pieces. I love those to death. Yes.
이번엔 한국은 어느 곳을 가는 게 좋을지 질문하는데요.
Should you take a trip to Korea, which I highly recommend, what do you want to see? Do you want to see museums? Do you want to see historical sites? Do you want to see Buddhist temples? Because they're sort of in different places. Some of them overlap.
모우리는 관객에게 서울을 관람 후 다음은 경주를 꼭 가봐야 한다고 말하는데요. 박물관이나 유적지, 절 등 볼 것들이 그곳에 다 있다고 말하며 그 이외에도 아름다운 조각, 건축물, 도자기, 그림 등 이 모든 것이 다 있다고 말하며 강의를 마친 그는 강의가 끝나고도 한국 문화의 아름다움을 재차 강조했습니다. 한국엔 어느 나라도 따라올 수 없는 아름다운 문화유산이 많이 있다는 것이 뿌듯하고 감격스럽기까지 한데요. 앞으로도 잘 보존하고 발전시켜 나갔으면 좋겠습니다. 이상 하디슈월드였습니다. 감사합니다.